name's Simon Collinson. I'm the director of City-REDI. I'm Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor for Regional Engagement at the University of Birmingham. A real pleasure to welcome all the outside guests as well as our internal City-REDI guests to this seminar. I'm chairing just on behalf of Carolyn. Carolyn is on the call, but her Wi-Fi is dodgy, so she's worried about dropping out. So I'll moderate. And normally in these sessions, if you have a question of clarification, do try and put your hand up or put it on the chat, but we tend to save the questions and the Q&A and the discussion until after the guest speakers spoken. So it is a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today on the City-REDI seminar series, Dr. John Moffat, Associate Professor in Economics at Durham University Business School. He's been there since 2013. And prior to that, had a lot of experience as a researcher on spatial economics at the University of Glasgow, and also a research assistant at Strathclyde on the impact of higher education institutions on regional economies. Main areas of interest are policy evaluation, productivity analysis, spatial economics, and labour economics, all of which is really core to what we do at City-REDI. So welcome, John, and John is going to speak to us today on the effect of R&D co-location on innovative activities in Great Britain. And the slides are already up. I'll hand over to you, John. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I suppose this, the first thing I should, the first thing I say is thank you very much for inviting me to give a presentation. I suppose this paper is one of those papers which we've been working on for quite a long time, and it has evolved. And as I was saying just before we started, you will notice the evolution even in the title. So the title is a little bit different to what was advertised, what I gave when I was initially asked to do it. So we've kind of broadened out the analysis. We're not just going to look at R&D as a dependent variable. And as part of that, if you like, evolution, some of the sort of key results have changed as well. This is joint work with Richard Harris, who's a professor here in Durham. And at the bottom, you'll see that there's our usual ONS disclaimer. So this is using ONS microdata. In terms then of, it's not changing. Yes, it is. In terms then of motivation for this work, I suppose we're in the fortunate position as regional economists at the moment that we don't really struggle for motivation, because of course the UK government has made, as we all know, has made levelling up the economy one of its main priorities. Some things have got in the way, most obviously the pandemic, but nevertheless, that's something that they're focused on. And after a certain delay, we've now got the white paper, which sets out, in a sense, its analytical framework for understanding the drivers of spatial disparities in economic activity. And I should emphasize it's only one, but one of the policy tools it's looking at is measures to encourage clustering. Okay, now this presentation is, I suppose, is interested, if you like, in spatial co-location more generally. And I do appreciate that there would be people that would draw a distinction between clusters and spatial co-location more generally. But I think it's reasonable to use this as motivation. When the government sort of refers to clustering, I mean, my reading of it is, and you get this sense much more strongly by looking at the government's innovation strategy, that it is thinking in terms of, if you like, R&D or innovation, clusters. That's what it seems to be. As I say, there is this innovation strategy, which was from 2021, which discusses this. So that's kind of why we're looking at it. I suppose, I mean, I certainly wouldn't describe myself, if you like, as a cluster skeptic. But when you look at the sort of literature on this, there's basically, I mean, there's been empirical studies which have found an absence of positive effects of co-location. Some found negative effects. And there's also some good theoretical reasons for thinking that, if you like, co-location of R&D might not have the sort of beneficial effects that the government seems to think it does have. So I think this is still something that's worth looking at. And particularly in the context of the UK, I'm not aware, there's been plenty of papers, and indeed we've written some of them, looking at the effect of spatial co-location on productivity, but less looking at the effect on R&D and innovative activities. Okay, so that's kind of where we're looking, that's the motivation, that's where we're looking to contribute. Turning then to the sort of relevant literature, one of the things I quite enjoyed about this paper is looking a little bit, and it very much is a little bit, I've sort of dipped my toe in the water, on the sort of theoretical side of spillovers. Now, I'm an empirical person, so I'm not at all going to pretend that I sort of understand all the equations involved in the sort of theoretical modeling of these non-tournament models of R&D. But I think there's certainly insights that you can get from them. And I'm just going to take one equation, which I think is quite useful. And particularly what this equation shows is how these models tend to incorporate the idea of spillovers. So you can see here a formula for the marginal cost of production. And essentially what this formula tells us is that if the firm chooses to do no R&D and it gets no R&D spillovers, then its marginal cost is A. Okay. Its marginal cost can be reduced either by doing R&D, so that's lowercase xi, or by receiving spillovers. Okay, that's how these things are typically modeled in the theoretical literature. Now, if you like, we can consider this sum of beta times xj as the total contribution of spillovers. Okay, so clearly what it indicates is that there's two factors at play here. First of all, the extent of spillovers is a function both of the amount of, if you like, R&D that is done by other firms, and also by this beta. Okay, and beta is very important. So beta is bounded by 0 and 1, and it controls the rate at which R&D from other firms spills over. In other words, has an effect on the focal firm's marginal cost, firm I's marginal cost. So there's many things, as I say, that will have an effect on beta. We can certainly think of that as something that's endogenous, and I'll come back to that. But of course, our focus, as I feel like a regional economist, tends to be geographic distance. So we expect that beta is a decreasing function of distance. Okay, the greater distance between plant I or firm I and firm J, okay, would have an effect then on the extent of spillovers between those two firms. Okay, but there's other things as well we can think of. And one sort of thing that is very clear from the literature is that there almost seems to be, there's something of a divide. So some people will focus on geography. Understandably, that's perhaps where they come from. So they'd be thinking in terms of what, if you like, defines the scope of these spillovers. Well, geographic distance. Others focus much more on technological distance. Okay, so often they'll use, for example, data on patents to construct measures of the technological distance between two firms. Okay, now those distances, and they may well either crudely or or not at all look at geography. Okay, so they will simply say, well, it doesn't really matter where you're located. If you're technologically close, then you can get spillovers. Okay, so obviously, I sort of belong to that. The sort of tradition looks at geographic distance. Okay, as they feel like something that affects beta here, the extent of spillovers. Other things that we can think of, and I'll come back to this, absorptive capacity. We can also think of, it's important to understand the spillovers are likely to be asymmetric. If you're at the technological frontier, then, if you like, the knowledge produced by other firms is likely to be of less use. Okay, if you like, a laggard firm, for want of a better phrase, then locating close to firms at the technological frontier is likely to be more beneficial. Okay, but there's many other things, as I say, that have an effect on this beta. Okay. So what does this sort of theory then suggest? Well, On one level, we can think of negative effects. So why would R&D co-location have a negative effect on, if you like, the R&D of the focal firm? So in my notation, firm I. Well, first of all, it introduces the potential for free riding. Okay, we can see that very clearly if we go back to the previous slide, that if somebody else does R&D, okay, boosts their R&D, you get spillovers from that. Okay, you can reduce your own R&D expenditure. Okay, so there's the potential, at least, for free riding. Okay, which would suggest that if you like, firm J increases its R&D, your optimal response might be to reduce your own R&D. Okay. We can also think about, again, thinking about it from the firm I's perspective. Very crudely, you can imagine a new firm opens up just down the road, and it's an R&D active firm. And it's also one of your competitors in product markets. Now, you're then faced with a choice. Do you increase, you might choose to decrease your R&D because by doing R&D, some of that leaks out. Okay. And if that firm to which it leaks out is a rival in product markets, that in a sense makes them stronger. Okay, that makes them, if you like, a fiercer competitor. It reduces their marginal cost. Okay, so again, that, if you like, expropriation avoidance effects might lead you to reduce your R&D. Okay, so we think of to say there's two reasons why we might think that since R&D co-location might lead to lower levels of R&D. But as we always like in empirical research, we like reasons for things to be positive and negative. We can also think of reasons why it might be the effect of R&D co-location might be positive. And the way we can think of this is by, well, one way is by, if you like, endogenizing beta. Okay, understanding that the rate at which knowledge spills over is a function of your absorptive capacity. So absorptive capacity refers to, in broad terms, the ability to internalize external knowledge, okay, to make use of the knowledge that, if you like, is about you, okay, to learn from it and use it for productive purposes. Okay. As you can see from the previous slide, xj could be an enormous number, but if beta is 0, then it doesn't matter. Okay, so if beta is endogenous, in other words, it is a function of your own R&D, okay, and traditionally that is what it's been thought to be. In empirical literature on absorptive capacity, a lot of people simply actually proxy for absorptive capacity using measures of R&D. So therefore, potentially, you need to invest in R&D in order to get spillovers from other firms. Okay, so that would suggest that actually, if you are co-located, if you're located next to lots of other firms doing R&D, then you need to invest yourself in R&D in order to benefit from that. Okay, in order to get some degree of spillovers. Okay, so that would suggest that actually the effect might be positive. Okay, now in terms of the effect on the production of knowledge, which I'm sort of loosely going to equate this to innovation outcomes. Okay, there's something of a disconnect here, I accept. So what the theory tends to do is it tends to consider that the production of knowledge leads to a reduction in marginal cost. But of course, the production of knowledge could also create new products. Okay, it could also be about that, and therefore, I'm going to sort of equate if you like, the production of knowledge and innovation outcomes. And my measure of innovation outcomes is going to be a measure of whether or not you've introduced new to market products. Yeah. Basically, the theory suggests that, perhaps unsurprisingly, given what we've seen for R&D, that the effect on innovation outcomes is ambiguous. Okay, it depends on other features of the model, in particular, the rate of spillover. Okay, so that's the sort of, if you like, what sort of theoretical underpinnings of this. In terms of what other people have found, what we've tended to find, I'd say, is generally positive effects on innovation. And we've got papers from the UK that have looked at this. So De Groot is a review article. It's a meta-analysis, so you get a nice overview of the literature. And what they tend to suggest is positive effects of co-location with innovative firms from the same sector. Okay, so this, if you like, is intra-industry spillovers, intra-industry co-location. Okay, being located next to firms or close to firms from the same sector. Not such strong effects from co-location with firms from different sectors. Okay, or inter-industry effects. In terms of the effects on R&D, well, it's not such a big literature, that. And as far as I'm aware, although people may well be able to contradict me, no one's used this, no one's done what we're doing here and looked at the effect on R&D or using data from the UK. But the bulk of the literature, if you like, suggests is in line with this sort of free-riding expropriation avoidance story. In other words, negative effects. Although again, positive effects have been obtained by some people. Okay, so that's the literature side of things. Turning then to the data. So the main data set we're going to use is the UK Innovation Survey. So the UK Innovation Survey is, as it says there, so it occurs every 2 years. It surveys around 14,000 businesses. So just to be clear, the unit of analysis in the UK Innovation Survey is the reporting unit, but in the survey itself, it refers to businesses. So I'll use their terminology and also refer to businesses. We can merge or append those different waves of the UK Innovation Survey. Now, one thing just to point out, that this isn't really a very good panel. Okay, and what I mean by that is you tend not to observe the same firms in consecutive waves, same businesses in consecutive waves, and that's deliberate, and particularly the case in more recent waves of CIS, because basically the ONS is trying to avoid or reduce the burden on respondents. So if you were surveyed last time, they will, if you like, that'll reduce the probability you are surveyed this time, which is good for the respondent, but less good for us because it makes it much more difficult for us to use proper panel data estimators. So we're using 8 waves of the UK Innovation Survey, and basically it gives us our dependent variables. Okay, what does it give us? It gives us data on R&D expenditure. I should be a little bit more precise. It's actually intramural and extramural R&D expenditure. And importantly, it also gives us some information on innovation. Okay, and that's what, in a sense, the obvious, the alternative would be to use data from that last data set I mentioned there, the BIRD data set, but it doesn't give me any information on innovation. Okay, so I need to use the UK Innovation Survey to get the innovation data. Particularly what I'm going to use is a measure of the percentage of turnover from new to market goods and services. Now that's quite a narrow definition. Okay, and it's something that I should go back and look at to see whether it makes any difference if I allow for just innovate or the turnover that's from new to firm products. Okay, but in a sense, new to market, I would think it's what most people would have in mind when they think about innovation, I suppose. It's not just that though. We're also using data from the annual respondents database, annual business survey, annual inquiry into foreign direct investment, and I say the BIRD dataset. Where the BIRD dataset comes in, and also the ARD and ABS, so just to be clear, the ABS takes over, so the annual business survey takes over from the annual respondents database in 2008. So you can think of them as very similar, okay? One of the issues in this literature, as well, I'm sure you're all aware, is this modifiable areal unit problem. And all that refers to is the problems associated with the use of administrative boundaries to construct, for example, here, measures of co-location. So for example, you could just construct some measure, a location quotient for Durham, okay, or the Northeast, or nuts 1, nuts 2, nuts 3, whatever level you want. And that's going to give you a different picture each time of the extent of co-location. So we're going to we avoid that. Okay, basically we're going to use a distance-based measure of co-location. And that is calculated using the formula that you see on the slide. So just to talk you through it, basically this is done at the plant level. Okay, this is important. I can't do this at using the business level because of course businesses can comprise more than one plant. So to use the business level, I'm sort of basically forcing all plants to belong to exist in the same location, which of course isn't accurate. So instead, as I construct this measure at the plant level, the first step is I need to calculate the distance between all my different plants. Okay, and that's basically I have a big matrix of distances between plants. Now that's done at the postcode district level. So just to be clear, so the postcode district is either the first 3 or 4 digits of your postcode. So I take the centroid of that postcode district and I'm calculating distances between those different centroids of postcode districts. So I'm up here in Durham, so my postcode district would be DH1. Okay. Once I've got that, okay, I plug it into this formula here. And you can see, just to be clear, 0.05 in a sense is a decay function. Okay. What that effectively does, and you can see this by if you plot the function, is it basically means that beyond 100 kilometers, okay, plants don't really contribute to this distance index. Okay, so yes, I'm not using administrative boundaries, which is a good thing, but I do still have to specify this decay function of 0.05. So in other work, we've used other decay functions of 0.01, 0.1. I think the results were broadly comparable, okay, but nevertheless, I mean, this is something that we have to choose a priori. The thing on the right-hand side is basically the weight, okay? So what I'm doing here is I am weighting by R&D expenditure, okay? So basically, if you're located next to, if you consider sort of 2 plants, one is located next to a plant that does 1,000 pounds of R&D, another one next to a plant of 1 million that does 1 million pounds of R&D, then those weights, okay, will ensure that the co-location index for the latter plants is larger. Okay, so it's important to use those weights. Okay, so what this is going to give me, okay, is for each plant, okay, a measure of co-location. Okay, it's going to be larger if they're spatially co-located. In other words, they're located like next to plants doing lots of R&D, and it's going to be small if it's, I don't know, up in the Highlands of Scotland, far away from any plant doing R&D. Okay, it's also bounded between 0 and 1. Other thing just to point out is that I'm going to construct 2 of these indices. Okay, the first one is going to be my intra-industry co-location index. And that is constructed using only distances to plants in the same 3-digit SIC sector. So that's intra-industry. Okay. My inter-industry co-location index is constructed using distances to plants in other sectors. Okay. So I'm not, if you like, double counting. Okay. The intra is calculated using the distances to plants in the same industry or sector. And the other one is only considers other sectors. Okay. Once I've got this, so I get a big database, okay, at the plant level. Obviously, some of the businesses comprise more than one plant. So basically, I take a weighted average using employment across the plants in the reporting unit or the business, and that will give me this index at the business level. Okay, which of course is what I need because the UK Innovation Survey is a business level survey. Okay, quickly then, in terms of descriptive statistics, I'm going to do this analysis for high tech and low tech separately, partly because I expect different levels of absorptive capacity, and therefore, it's reasonable to think that you might get different results across sectors. And broadly speaking, this lines up with what you'd anticipate. So R&D at the extensive margin is higher in high tech. At the intensive margin, it's also higher. Okay, just to be clear, you can interpret this loosely as a percentage. It's not really a percentage because I suppose you could have a firm that spends more on R&D than it gets in turnover, but of course that doesn't happen very much. So this is basically R&D expenditure divided by turnover times 100. Okay, so this is, as I say, greater for high-tech than low-tech firms. Innovation, again, at the extensive margin, is bigger for high-tech than low-tech. But interestingly, innovation intensity, in other words, for those that actually do innovate, okay, is about the same, okay, across these two sectors. Okay. In terms of my indices of co-location, well, we see slightly higher values in for intra than inter-industry co-location, okay, in the high-tech sector. Okay. Moving on to some maps, just because we like maps. Now, in a way, you know, I'd say this, the one on the left isn't actually hugely helpful. And the reason it's not too helpful is because it sort of conceals so much variation across industries. Okay, so but obviously I can't just, I'm not going to sort of bore you for, 30 minutes with endless maps showing these intra-industry indices for different industries. But basically, what do we see? Well, we see that co-location is sort of higher, sort of around London, and then sort of heading up, I suppose, although I think it just misses Birmingham, but in that direction. Okay. The inter-industry, okay, so again, just to be clear, what you're seeing on the left-hand side is a measure of co-location with businesses in the same industry. On the right-hand side, you're seeing co-location or measures of co-location with firms or businesses in different industries. Okay, so with inter-industry, now I just want to make a quick point. These are calculated using the estimation sample. In other words, what I'm actually going to stick into regressions. Okay, I haven't deliberately included the R&D sector, okay, in my estimation sample, because it seems weird to model R&D for the R&D sector. Okay, it would be a strange business in the R&D sector that wasn't doing any R&D. Okay, but these co-location indices are constructed in such a way that they do take account of distances to and the R&D of businesses in the R&D sector. So the indices account for the R&D sector, but the estimation sample leaves it out. Okay, and I think that's important because, of course, why shouldn't the R&D sector give you spillovers? Right? It seems reasonable. Okay, and that might explain the difference, or part of the reason why we get a difference in these two maps. Okay. Turning then to my outcome variables, so I've got the extensive margin of R&D here. Okay, I'm showing you this so you get a sort of visual feel for whether or not that there's similarities between this and the co-location indices. And I'd say for R&D innovation and also for R&D intensity, broadly speaking, it's not identical. You know, there looked to be a correlation with what we saw on the previous slide, but that's less so for innovation intensity. Okay, so basically, you know, the remainder of the presentation is going to be an empirical analysis, which is, of course, controlling for various things, but looking at the effect of these things on these things. Okay, you know, controlling for various factors. So I'm sort of aware of time. So how do we do this? Nothing particularly sophisticated. So basically, we're going to use a probit model to look at the effect of the two variables I'm really interested in. So D intra and D inter. So there's my index of R&D of intra-industry R&D co-location and inter-industry R&D co-location. So I'm interested in beta 1 and beta 2. So I'm going to use a probit model. So Y basically is going to be equal to 1 if you do R&D, okay, or is equal to 1 if you innovate, okay, which in my case means introduces a new product, okay, or had positive sales of a new product, okay. So that's our probit model. I'll talk about the control variables shortly. For the intensive margin, this is what I'm going to do. I use a Tobit model. I'm always a bit uncomfortable with using a Tobit model because it sort of implies the existence of this underlying latent variable, okay, but which in theory can be negative, okay. So, but nevertheless, this is often used in this literature. But I think one thing that I'm going to go back at to look at in the future is sort of variations of this. I mean, one thing I have done actually is done a very simple OLS approach where I just said, if you like, the zero is equal to missing. So work on a truncated sample. And the results are broadly similar, but nevertheless, this is something that requires further work. So, but anyway, in a nutshell, I'm going to use a Tobit model to estimate the effect of my two measures of co-location on the ratio of R&D expenditure to turnover and the percentage of turnover from sales of goods or services that are new to the market. Okay, so those are my measures of intensity. I'm going to estimate the model as well, as I said earlier, for high-tech and low-tech sectors. One thing I just want to emphasize here, okay, the only thing really I want you to take account of, my co-author thinks this is going to be confusing, so I need to do justice to this. These first two variables here, okay, basically I am controlling for, if you like, general co-location. Okay, what do I mean like that? Basically, I construct my index, okay, that you saw earlier on, but rather than using R&D weights, I use employment weights. Okay, now that's important, okay, in terms of avoiding omitted variables bias. Okay, so as I say, the way I think about this is, clearly, if you like, inter-industry employment co-location will be correlated with inter-industry R&D co-location. Okay, and that's well known. Basically the distribution of R&D, well, certainly not perfectly, but to some extent mirror the distribution of economic activity more generally. Okay, so I need to control for that. Okay, but to be clear, the distinction, okay, is in the weights. Okay, so with the R&D co-location, one way of thinking about this, if you don't do R&D, well, you don't contribute anything. Okay, well, clearly in this case, everyone has some employment. Okay, so everyone, again, it's weighted, but everybody contributes to this index. Okay, so I only think of this as a control variable. My interest is in the effect of intra-industry and inter-industry R&D co-location, but it's important to control for this to avoid an omitted variables bias story. Okay, so that's in there, and as you can see, so are various other things, which I'm not going to talk about. Perhaps the only thing that's worth pointing out is that, so we've got industry dummies at the same level, at 3-digit level. Obviously, we've got year dummies as well. Okay, various business characteristics and also various enterprise characteristics, because of course, a business can belong to a wider enterprise. This is the coefficients on the control variables. Again, mirroring what I said before, the only thing I want you to look at here is up here, okay, which says that, if you like, co-location, okay, or employment co-location has a negative effect on the extensive margin, okay, of R&D. Now, it's not always significant, okay, that's important to be clear about that, but nevertheless, it's always negative. Okay, so how do we interpret this? Well, I think the first thing to say is we've got to be careful about trying to sort of claim too much and say this is a causal effect. But nevertheless, this is, if you like, consistent with a kind of congestion story. Okay, so what we'll see in a second is it might be good to be co-located with other firms doing R&D or other businesses doing R&D, but just being co-located in general, okay, or employment co-located is not necessarily. It's not a good thing, okay? And we see that in the extensive margin. And as you can see again, if we look up at the top here, we see it at the intensive margin too. Okay, so employment co-location, okay, whether it's intra or inter-industry, okay, has a negative association with innovation activities. Okay, that's what these results are suggesting. Okay, but as I say, that's not my focus. I'm just checking the time, so let me keep going. So the next thing, and the thing that I'm really interested in then, is these coefficients, the marginal effects. So just to emphasize, in the previous slides, I just showed you coefficients, okay? So they don't have a natural interpretation because, of course, the Probit model is non-linear. But these are actually the marginal effects. So how do we interpret this? Okay, so one thing just to point out is that I've standardized here my co-location indices. So that allows us to interpret these marginal effects as showing a 1 unit increase corresponds to a 1 standard deviation increase. Okay, why is that useful? Because, as I said earlier on, my indices are bounded between 0 and 1. Okay, so a 1 unit increase in those indices is enormous. Okay, it's impossible. Okay, whereas obviously a 1 standard deviation increase is fine. Okay, so what's this showing? Okay, first of all, let's do this one. What does it suggest? Well, it suggests that in the high-tech sector, a 1 standard deviation increase in our index of intra-industry R&D co-location leads to an increase of 0.9%, okay, in the probability of conducting R&D. Okay, that's how we would interpret that. What about these other ones? Well, I want to emphasize as well, yes, you're seeing stars on the right-hand side, okay? And, we sometimes become a bit of, certainly my students become a bit obsessed with stars and think that's all that matters, but it's important to also look at the magnitude of the coefficients. There's not a big difference here. Okay, so yes, they're significant, but also look at the observation counts. Okay, we've got about 3 times as many observations for low tech than high tech, so it's not really surprising that things are significant, or coefficients of comparable magnitude are significant for low tech and not in high tech. So, I mean, my reading of this is that the coefficients are actually broadly similar. Okay, one exception, I suppose, is there. Okay, clearly it's larger. The effect on R&D of inter-industry R&D co-location is larger in low tech, but otherwise these are of a similar magnitude. How do we interpret this? Well, what this lines up with is the story we were saying earlier on about absorptive capacity. Okay, maybe you need to invest in R&D in order to build the absorptive capacity to benefit from spillovers from proximate or firms that neighboring businesses or firms. Another thing I think is interesting is that these, the inter-industry R&D co-location effects tend to be a bit larger. Okay, which I think is, now how do we interpret that? Well, one way, I mean, there's potentially lots of ways of interpreting it, but one way of interpreting it is to think about the this expropriation avoidance effect. Okay, if you do R&D and generate spillovers for a firm that is not a competitor, okay, then that's less problematic than it is if you generate R&D spillovers, which allows, if you like, your competitor to introduce a new product, and which in a sense allows them to take some of your market share. So in other words, this expropriation avoidance effect, you might expect to be stronger for intra-industry spillovers. Why? Because they're much more likely to be your competitors in product markets. Okay, if you give spillovers to businesses in other sectors, that's not quite so concerning. Okay, but if it's somebody that you directly compete with, okay, that's a bigger problem. Okay, so that's the extensive margin. Okay, so slightly bigger effects from inter-industry R&D co-location, but nevertheless, everything is positive. Okay, apart from that one. Turning then to the intensive margin, again, a positive, lots of positive effects, and again, larger effects for inter-industry R&D co-location. So actually, these results kind of mirror what we saw before. Just in terms of the magnitudes, clearly, this is the way this has been done is we're looking that the R&D and innovation intensity are both measured as percentages. So in other words, that's why we see bigger effects here, because it can go from 0 up to 100. But nevertheless, I say the results are roughly in line with what we saw, certainly in terms of significance and sign. And again, as I say, the positive, larger effects from inter-industry R&D co-location than intra-industry R&D co-location. And again, not a huge difference, I think, in the size of the coefficients and the magnitude of the coefficients across high tech and low tech. One final thing I just want to say before I'm almost done is you would expect the innovation effects to be bigger than the R&D effects. Now, why would that be? Well, suppose, if we think back to the formula we saw earlier, if you like the R&D co-location index goes up, in other words, you get more spillovers, and then you respond to that by increasing your own R&D, well, that implies, a larger effect on innovation, okay, than on R&D. In other words, you both get the benefit of your increased R&D expenditure and also the benefit of the spillovers. So this finding that the innovation effects are a bit larger, particularly the intensive margin, than the R&D effects is pretty much what I would expect, having found positive effects on R&D. Okay. Results then, I think I've covered all this then, but this just summarizes what I was saying before. So given the time, I will continue. Yes, I've said all that. Okay, so in conclusion, I say, what have we done? Well, we basically looked at the effect of intra and inter R&D, intra-industry and inter-industry R&D co-location on the intensive and extensive margins of R&D and innovation. In terms of policy implications, I don't have, I probably need to think more about this, but broadly speaking, it's supportive. Okay, we see positive effects on both R&D and innovation. I mean, the worry would have been if I find, for example, big negative effects in R&D, in other words, big, strong free riding effects or expropriation avoidance effects, and perhaps no effect on innovation. Okay, that would suggest that maybe this idea of R&D clustering isn't necessarily the best one. Okay, but we're not finding that at all. Okay, in terms of the results, let's say they do broadly support the government's ideas of using, if you like, cluster policy as one way of leveling up the UK economy. The only sort of kind of wrinkle in that is I do think it's worth pointing out that the effects are bigger for inter-industry. Now, it's tricky to draw policy implications, or at least sensible policy implications, because you could argue, well, what's the solution? We should create cities, okay, which is daft. But nevertheless, it does suggest that we should think about the diversity of clusters. Right? And also, I think the finding that it's not just high-tech sectors that benefit. Again, if you look through the leveling up white paper, it tends to be about kind of high-tech sectors. I mean, this is something you also see in the, I think they're called local industrial strategies. Again, a lot of LEPs would say that their strength was in some high-tech sector. But actually, what we see here is that clustering, or at least spatial co-location, doesn't just benefit high-tech sectors. The results suggest they also benefit low-tech sectors. So that's me. Any questions?
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Hands up or just join in if you've got questions. There's a lot to talk about there. Let me start while people think about it. Just picking up your final point. It might be the case, probably stretching away from your data a bit, to suggest that the intra-industry effect gives a good reason why path dependency tends to get locked in. So in a sense, when you've got an existing cluster within a sector, and in the West Midlands, that's advanced automotive manufacturing, it tends to attract up or down the supply chain or the value chain, like complementary industry investments, and therefore the spillovers and the cluster tend to go along a particular trajectory. And that fits into the current discussion about innovation accelerators, because there is a discussion about sticking to your knitting and asking for public money to do more of the things you already do well, versus diversifying the portfolio and investing in nascent or emerging industries. And again, that stretches a bit away from your data, but is that consistent with the intra-industry findings, John?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it is a limitation, and I've actually got a PhD student working on this, which looking at rather than just, because we've got to say, it's using 3-digit SIC is crude. Defining that as intra. So basically that's where and everyone else is inter is crude. And in the past, what we've done is I think we use input-output tables to sort of define, if you like, groups of industries. I think that would be something that would be sort of interesting to look at. I think it relates to what you're saying. No, and also to turn your point, I mean, you're absolutely right. There is certainly also correlation, to use the econometric term, or correlation over time in these clusters. Indeed, one of the things I try to do, in fact, I spent far too much trying to do, is try to use a kind of fixed effects type estimator, which would rely on variation over time in these distance indices. But actually, there's not that much variation. Okay, and that's not surprising, because as you say, over a 2-year period, clusters, or if you like, spatial concentrations don't disappear and they don't grow. So I don't have that much variation over time. And that's econometrically awkward, actually. That means that I have to rely on cross-sectional variation, whereas I would like to be able to rely on variation across time as well. But so that backs up what you're saying, yeah.
No, thanks. I'm wondering if Raquel will jump in. She's quite an expert on regional specialization and smart specialization. That speaks to the dilemma with being good at a narrow range of things, but being less resilient to when the world changes, versus the economies of scale and other advantages of regional specialization. I don't know if you wanted to comment, Raquel.
First, apologies, because I was giving a paper in a Regional Studies Association seminar. Is finished at 1:10 So sorry about if what I'm going to ask, you already explained it before I arrive. I think that what you are doing resonates a bit with the relatedness and complexity kind of literature. So even now, when you were talking about using input-output, even more. I wonder, in your econometric analysis, when you are putting Herfindahl indexes and also inter-industry collocation indexes, if you find an association with them, or if somehow the intra-regional intra-industry collocation, it might be heavily associated with your Herfindahl industries index. Maybe you want to elaborate a bit on that, and apologies if you already have explained it before.
No, I didn't talk about it. I mean, the Herfindahl index, so the Herfindahl index is actually constructed. It's not, I feel like, a spatial Herfindahl index. It's a I think if it was, you'd be absolutely right. I mean, nevertheless, there could be a relationship. I mean, so I've constructed the Herfindahl index at the industry level. I think you're right. I mean, it would be very closely related, but I think also, I mean, and it's something I hadn't really thought about, but they're definitely, I should look at the sort of complexity, because clearly that does link in or relate to the inter-industry indices, definitely, yeah.
And maybe a related question is about, so here you are mixing manufacturing and services industries, isn't it? So I wonder if you see any differences when you are only looking at collocation of manufacturing or collocation of services. So it might eventually explain much better the diversification and value chains that Simon was referring to, where you have a mix, of tasks coming from services and manufacturing, and the combination in places. It might also make these places more resilient. Or if we think about the analysis we have done, for instance, on Brexit, those service specialized places, they were more resilient towards trade, right? But it might be that also they are more dependent in a particular type of skills or things like that. So I think that you might want to look at the differences between manufacturing services and what happened when you are focusing only on one or another. And also another question is about, do you think that there is an optimal collocation level for those indexes? So you are looking only at the direct linear effect, but what if, as you see with the Herfindahl, actually there is a non-linear effect and you have an optimal level of collocation there? Then it might be that, they have a different shape depending on intra or inter collocation.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, I suppose with with the Herfindahl index, we always include a square, largely because there's that kind of well, if you like, grounded theoretical prediction that there is a nonlinear, the inverse U shape, and we do actually find that. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, we could definitely consider that. Whether that might also apply to these indices, because you're right. We are imposing a linear relationship. So yeah, that's yes. On the manufacturing services thing. I don't know if Richard's here, but he liked that comment because we started off doing manufacturing versus services, and then I lumped them together. Partly just because, so the issue was basically you don't have that much high tech manufacturing. That's ultimately the problem. So the sample sizes get small. So that's why I lumped it together with knowledge intensive. I think that's what they call it. Knowledge intensive services. That said, when I did initially do that, I was using a different method. So it's possible actually that doing what I'm doing now, it might work better. So yeah, it's something that I should go back to. Yeah, thank you.
And Anne has a question, or a hand up at least, Anne.
Yeah, well, actually, Raquel asked about services and manufacturing, which I was going to ask about, but I've got a couple of other things. One, which is you've answered in part, John, about the 3-digit level. I mean, have you tried doing it at the 2-digit level of SIC, say, for example, or what do you think any difference would be? And my other question, as you talked about this, made me think, do you think there's anything about how, this is about geography, you showed your maps. Do you think that actually co-location might matter more in some types of local areas than in others? I mean, have you sort of considered sort of running some of this, for a subset of your data in some different kinds of regions, for example?
The honest answer is no to that latter question. But yeah, I agree. I mean, it's something that I could do. I mean, I guess we're always kind of worried about what London's doing, in this sort of analysis. Is it, if you like, too influential, or is it kind of driving the results? So I certainly agree that it would be interesting to sort of look at results, for different areas. I mean, one of the constraints is sample size, and I think that is something that kind of hinders us a little bit. But I mean, we could split into two, if you like, big regions. That would be possible. I don't see an issue with that. I mean, on your first question, again, the answer is no. We haven't tried for this analysis constructing the indices at other levels. So you say using 2 digits or 4 digits. We have done it for another paper. And I'm struggling to remember what the answer was, if it made much of a difference. I think it didn't. But I mean, one if I'm going to be honest, one issue is that these indices take quite a long time to create. I mean, the file works now, but I have to sort of leave it running for quite a while. But nevertheless, I think you're right. I think particularly I should try, I don't know, is 2-digit too broad? I worry about
one of these
digits.
things, John, that in some places it would be too broad and in some sectors it wouldn't. So it's not an easy thing. But I think it would be quite interesting. I appreciate what you say about the sample size issues, but it is something that, at the 3-digit level, you could conceivably do with London or the Greater Southeast. I do tend to do the Greater Southeast versus the rest or something. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
I mean, I think you're on the 2-3 digit thing. I mean, I think that's probably not a bad thing to do anyway. I mean, if nothing else, it's a good robustness check. So it's something, that if I'm honest, I'd quite like to see as well. So yeah, I'll try that. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks, Anne and John. We're going to wrap up very soon. Any other questions? I have one more. So in the absence of others, I'll jump in again if that's all right. Just on spillovers, the literature's slightly mixed on this. Some theoretical interpretations talk about almost serendipitous interactions, as it were. So the idea of the concept of spillover captures all interactions. Other literature actually quite explicitly differentiates between proactive, facilitated interaction versus, including joint ventures and alliances between co-located firms, but also something we're working on, intermediaries, which are bridge builders or technology transfer centers. So my assumption is that you are, with your concept, capturing all kinds of interactions, but under the terminology of spillovers.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is, but I mean, what would be wonderful is, I mean, an issue with this whole literature is you don't know the nature of the interactions. There is this presumption that you in some way interact with the firm down the road. But, and it would be absolutely wonderful now if we sort of had more data on whether it was, the type of interactions, as you say, is it, if you like, formal interaction that has perhaps been facilitated by, I don't know, a government body, or if it is, as you say, serendipitous. I think in the UK Innovation Survey, I mean, something that we use in a much earlier version of the paper, there is information on who you cooperate and, moreover, where they are. So it refers to your region. Now, I can't remember if it actually defines your region. I assume it's referring to government office region. What's frustrating is there's also a question on sources of knowledge, which would be even better, but it's not regionally differentiated. So it would be great if it told you, where do you get your knowledge from, or your source of knowledge for innovation? Is it your, I don't know, people in the same firms in the same industry? And then where are they? It doesn't tell you where they are. So they tell you they're getting knowledge from their competitors, but we don't know where they are. So we get that answer for the cooperation, which is, if you like, more formal. Now, again, we don't know exactly what a cooperative agreement or cooperation means, because I think with a lot of this, I mean, sure, there's guidelines, that firms follow, and I should look at the guidelines to just check exactly what it refers to. But it's not, certainly wouldn't tell us whether it had been, if you like, formally arranged.
One of the ways, so we're trying to connect the same dots as you, I think, which is really fascinating, and we've really enjoyed your presentation. We're looking at Innovate UK data, which specifies formalized joint ventures where there's co-funding between firms and universities. I've in the past used joint venture agreements and contracts to look at firms, but you get a sort of micro view. Connecting the micro view to your macro view is actually a challenge that I think we're all facing, and I think it's a really interesting one. So with that, though, time is up. John, again, many, many thanks. That was a fascinating paper, a lot of rigor and robustness, but again, some interesting questions about definitions and interpretations, but really appreciated your talk. Are your slides available for us? Can we use those? Is that all right?
Yeah, happy to send them over. Yeah.
Super. John, thank you very much. And again, thank you very much, everybody, and to Carolyn and Raquel for organising the seminar series today, and for everybody for questions and for all your attendance. And do enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.